This post started off as a tweet, but I realized that I didn't have enough space to write what I wanted to say. I could have written a thread, but I don't think the algorithm is showing threads like it used to. The Enlightenment-driven secularization of society in the 18th and 19th centuries created a vacuum in the religious needs of man. Make no mistake, we need religion. Of course, the true reason we need religion is because God created us to be in union with Him, and it is through religion that man can be in union with God in this fallen world. If, ironically, we want to relativize this argument and rely only on empirical data, an unfortunate consequence of the Enlightenment in itself, all you have to do is look at human history. Every single human society has, quote, developed, quote, a, quote, religion. Religion, mind you, is not the same thing as a belief in God. It is possible for someone to believe in God or gods and not follow a religion, but you can also believe in food but not eat. See how much good that does you. The, quote, spiritual but not religious phenomenon is a fundamentally modern phenomenon, and is not what I am referring to when I am referring to religion. If I must use a relativized definition for religion, I will use the definition provided by Father Stephen DeYoung in the Lord of Spirits podcast. Religion is a way of being in the world that encompasses all levels of reality and expresses itself in practices. But back to the vacuum. The religious vacuum left by enlightened secularization necessarily had to be, quote, filled. And necessarily anything that is not religious cannot fill the gap left by religion, if religion is the method in which we come into communion with the Most High. Nothing but divinely revealed religion can fill that space. But the 18th and 19th century Europeans tried. They tried by using possibly the next best thing: art. Art is a result of the creative spirit of man, that spirit we have by virtue of being made in the image of the Creator, and using that virtue creates something that participates in beauty, an uncreated energy of God that is God Himself. The religion which was deemed to be a dark superstition by the enlightened philosophies was put away, but the subtle shadows remained. Art in the 18th and 19th centuries became sacralized. The artist became the high priests of European society. As historian Timothy C.W. Blanning points out in his book The Romantic Revolution, A History, Europeans of the Romantic era, in the shadow of the Enlightenment, made pilgrimages to locations related to their favorite creators and even fictional stories, called people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau a, quote, prophet and, quote, saint. And Romantic hero Beethoven's funeral eulogy did not once mention God, but invoked art in the same rhetorical language as God. Art gives man the opportunity to contemplate the transcendental, possibly the closest experience man can have to the drawing effects of religion without religion itself. But it must necessarily fall short of the mark. Art was never strong enough to hold society together like religion once held it together. It could not hold back the tide of nihilism and atomism that the Industrial Revolution, the Darwinian Revolution, and the World Wars unleashed upon the world. It could not keep people's spirits up. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Art was sacralized and made a replacement for religion. In order to carry this task out, it tried to make itself as pretty as possible. Artists spoke about how, quote, deep their works were, unable to be understood by the, quote, Philistine public. Art had to come from the artist's heart, not simply through conventional artistic, stylistic, and technical rules. Art had to be made for art's sake, not for the sake of some end. Art was the end, not a means. But when art failed to hold things together, art was made profane. Trying to use art to find meaning is pointless, they said. The fact is there is no meaning, they said. art began to fall from grace. It was torn down from its high place. But there was no return to religion, and thus many continued to use art to fill in the gaps in their hearts, even while the transcendental properties that were once deemed crucial to art fell away. Now we do not even worship the transcendental art, we worship art that is a means in itself, but not an end. By definition, this is a consumer art. And make no mistake, nearly all art, even the good ones, are by definition consumer art when we are in a capitalist society. Without many even realizing, our religious impulses have been hijacked by companies. Woe to us! Now our communions, our fandoms, and our saints are fictional characters made to sell toys. Our scriptures are mass-produced Hollywood films engineered in a corporate writer's room. We make pilgrimages to conventions and call authorial intent the Word of God. The virtues that the tradition once sought to educate us in have been replaced by the propositions propagated by marketing teams. Once we celebrated holy feast days, and now we celebrate anniversaries of the founding of companies and speak, "May the 4th be with you." The same people who sneer at the religious for poring over encyclicals and church councils will then themselves scoff at Spider-Man fans for not knowing about a minor character who appeared in an issue in 1989. Our icons are toys and Funko Pops. Lately, I have been getting into the history and philosophy of art, its production, and different theories around how art should be critiqued. The Romantic Revolution, A History by Timothy Blanning has really altered my brain chemistry. But in understanding art and cultural movements since the Renaissance, I feel like I am beginning to learn how to navigate modernity in a better way. This study of application is still a work in progress, and I can't claim to have found the key, but something I've been trying to figure out for a long time is how to approach contemporary art, especially TV shows, animated shows, Hollywood films, video games, comics, and so on. I haven't really looked too much into music, that's not really my forte. These works are an important part of the popular culture of modernity, and I know I need a theory of it that is coherent with how I see the world. How many people on X are looking at the mass deportations of President Trump's second term and the cutting of funding to institutions like the United States Agency for International Development and are saying, quote, "You shouldn't have touched our video games," end quote, connecting the events of our times to the Gamergate phenomenon from 2014. The culture war is a real socio-political conflict that will be analyzed by historians in the future, enveloped in the context of the managerial hegemony that I believe is the defining element of the post-Cold War world order. I run a YouTube channel centered around the Hasbro Transformers franchise. I myself, as a product of the late 20th and 21st centuries, am a fan of Transformers, Star Wars, Batman, The Elder Scrolls, and much more. Franchise fiction is a definitive part of the artistic output of the late 20th and 21st centuries that, for the most part, are completely alien to the cultural landscape of mankind before that time. The Industrial Revolution, development of technology like animation and the television, and the post-war economic boom of the United States has completely transformed art in a way not seen since, well, perhaps since the invention of writing itself. With the advent of the post-war world, art began to diverge in two directions, into so-called high art and low art. Low art took advantage of the market economy and the expansion of leisure time to develop entertainment products. What differentiated high art and low art was motive. High art continued to follow traditional philosophies of art, whether that be to go through a process of introspection into one's own soul and put it on display interpretively, or to extract the beauty of nature into higher concentrations on the canvas through paint and brush, or to reveal something about the nature of mankind through words. It was art for art's sake, or art for the sake of the transcendental, patroned or otherwise. On the other hand, low art took the direction of art as a product, art for profit. Do not mistake these terms, high and low, as comments on quality. Rather, these terms differentiate between motive as well as method. It is completely possible for high art to be low in quality, see Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, just as it is possible for low art to be high in quality, see 1986's Transformers the movie. However, there is an undeniable trend in low art, particularly noticeable in what I will call long-running franchise fiction, to eventually become low in quality. When I think about my favorite franchises, Transformers, Star Wars, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and other long-running franchise fiction like comics in general, there is a tendency for these franchises to become low in quality over time. I think understanding this phenomenon and its causes is very important to understanding popular culture and its role in society in the 21st century. Long-running franchise fiction made for profit will tend towards slop. This is true even if it produces quality work from time to time. There are inherent qualities of long-running franchise fiction that create a pull towards becoming slop, such that quality works of fiction under this category thrive despite being franchise fiction rather than simply being exceptions to the rule. Let's analyze why. There are three elements at play in the creation of franchise fiction that pull it in such a direction. First, we can speak of franchise fiction's goal of appealing to the public. Art made for profit tends towards being easier understood to appeal to a wider potential customer base. This means that the work will typically be conventionally well-formed in aesthetics. In story, easier understood concepts will be used. This means that cliches and tropes will be frequently used and reused so that the widest possible audience will understand what the story is about to maximize profits. Secondly, we can speak of the franchise's need to make sure new installments maintain artistic cohesion within the franchise. Long-running franchise fiction must be fundamentally derivative, not only using mass-market appealing tropes and cliches as we mentioned in the point above, but also demanding that the fiction repackages old ideas and archetypes from previous iterations. If a work tries to be too innovative, its connection to the franchise as a whole becomes more tenuous. It must maintain a certain degree of sameness with previous works to maintain its connection to the franchise. This is also connected to the corporation's concept of the customer base. The fiction must maintain some degree of similarity to previous work to keep that portion of the target customer base, assuming the fandom is large enough that it is financially worth appealing to. Thirdly, there is the factor of the globalized market. The goal of any company is to reach a wider market, and this is the impetus behind globalization unlocked by technology. Mass market fiction must find a way to be relevant and appealing to cultures and people all around the world without distinction, meaning the fiction is even further limited to the lowest common denominator elements, tropes, cliches, derivations, a lack of intertextuality or context, a hindering of the ability to say anything of particular worth when speaking to an undefined audience. This leads to a sort of smoothing down of the fiction. These three factors, and indeed there are more, all ensure that long-running franchise fiction will tend towards slop. Understand that these things, conventional aesthetics, stories told through tropes and cliches, sameness with previous iterations, and trying to appeal to a globalized market, are not necessarily bad things by themselves. I know I certainly enjoy conventional aesthetic realism that commercialized fiction tends to rely upon, rather than overly abstract art, for example. But these things also pull art towards the direction of slop. there is an avoidance of risk-taking, of diverging too far from the base form of the franchise. When folk tales enter the hands of Disney to be adapted, they are smoothed down to meet the ideas of the international market. Tropes and cliches can be done well, but, as we see with Book Talk, the customer can be lured to tropes in and of themselves, and fiction is produced to specifically cater to that audience, turning fiction into the apotheosis of a single cliché or trope to the detriment of fiction in general. In short, don't misunderstand these things as, quote, reasons all low art sucks. Rather, understand that these things inherent to the category will pull franchise fiction into slop territory if special care and attention are not made by the creators and companies they work for. These are indeed constraints, but constraints can actually aid in creativity. However, we should also know that franchise fiction usually serves the role of entertainment, and we tend to be less picky and choosy about our entertainment by default. This is something companies take advantage of, and eventually we discover that everything we liked has turned into slop. These factors do not exclude the possibility of innovation or creativity occasionally, but this shows a tendency, a sort of gravity that pulls franchise fiction, driven by top-down corporate structures who are focused on profit, of this kind to be the lowest common denominator derivative works which are, by definition, slop. The time period in which fans of various fandoms realized just how slop their interest had become seems to have been the time period around roughly 2014 up to the 2020s, particularly in reaction to so-called social justice warriors, or wokeness, terminology I hate to use due to the fact that they are neologisms and therefore ambiguous. For the purposes of this essay, I will begrudgingly use them. Events from Gamergate to Star Wars Episode 8 The Last Jedi appears to have woken up many people to the sloppiness of their hobbies and interests, mainly through things like progressive propaganda. Thus, in reaction, many turned to the right wing, which had been framed as an enemy to this progressive propaganda. And here we are. Why did you force me to do this? I just wanted to play video games. There seems to be this idea that with this right-wing revolution seen with the second term of President Trump, we will be able to purge wokeness from our hobbies and bring about a golden age of entertainment. I agree that managerial and intersectionalist progressivism was indeed a civilizational crisis, of course, and I am very happy to see it on the back leg, but this is very important to understand. Eliminating wokeness alone will not save our fandoms. While nothing compared to the damage brought about by managerial progressivism, our fandoms have certainly gone through dark times before. It comes with being franchise fiction in the first place. The Unicron trilogy, before the release of the 2007 Transformers film, was not a particularly great era for the Transformers franchise when compared to Beast Wars or Transformers Prime. The prequel trilogy of Star Wars certainly wasn't well received by many, and it is only when compared to the sequel trilogy that we realize how good we had it. I guarantee that in any of your fandoms, there were dark times before now. Franchise fiction, if not taken care of properly, will become slop. This is why, while I love The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim with all my heart, I am not that interested in Elder Scrolls VI like others seem to be. I have seen Fallout 76 and Starfield, and I see Bethesda slipping into slop like all companies slip into when they forget what actually made their games quality. There's another factor to keep in mind as well, which is the kiddification of fiction. Children are a demographic that can be marketed to easily, even with low-quality slop. If a franchise, especially a franchise built around toys, can simply dumb itself down for a younger audience and gain a large customer base, it will do it even if it means throwing older fans away. This is how Disney handles folk tales. This is how Bethesda has been handling game design. This is how Transformers has been handling its plots since Transformers Prime, and even Transformers Prime's plot pales in comparison to Beast Wars' willingness to take risks and developing multi-layered storytelling. Interestingly enough, there's also an opposite direction that works complementary to the kiddification phenomenon, and that is the not just for kids model. I always frown when I see a post of someone clipping a children's show and saying, "This show is not for kids," or sarcastically, "and they say this is a kids show?" Yet when I watch the clip in question, it is never something out of place in a kids show, at least not by the standards of the 1980s or 1990s. Really, this is something that could be looked at in depth in its own essay. As a final note on kids fiction, I would say that it would be a good idea to not raise children on franchise fiction slop at all. Back in the day, kids used to read fairy tales, yes, even the grim ones. Folk tales, even epic poetry. Kids understand more than you think and don't need stories dumbed down the way franchise fiction slop approaches them. Rather, it is more meaningful to read things to them and talk to them to help them to understand what's happening. Hans Christian Andersen's collected short stories are particularly important stories in the Western world to develop the culture of children, and I hope to read Yae Theodora Ozaki's collection of Japanese fairy tales to my children in the future, as well as stories from Edith Hamilton's mythology and Bible stories. Children's fiction should not be dumbed down stories. They should be stories that inspire morals and virtue. We forget that the word culture did not originally mean what we think it means today. Culture refers to the cultivation of a virtuous life, and childhood is the most important time to cultivate virtue. A lot of modern franchise fiction, especially those aimed at children, do not propagate actual virtue. Indeed, the virtues are often looked down upon in the modern world, and the spirit of the age naturally affects consumerist fiction. Instead, in order to get your attention, and therefore your money, corporations give you sensation. As it was alluded to in The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis, in order for children to understand how to slay dragons, they must learn through fiction how to slay dragons. Modern children's fiction does not show children how to meaningfully slay dragons, but it does tell them to follow the managerial values of being generally polite and nice and easily controllable. But either way, even children's fiction is giving way to TikTok and the iPad brain rot. In the cultivation of virtue in children, there must be a return to literature. It would be a mistake to say that consumerist fiction can't help the cultivation of virtues, or that even entertainment itself cannot be deep and worth contemplating. In order to illustrate this, I'd like to talk about Shakespeare and Sherlock Holmes, and how they point to how low art can be just as helpful as high art in cultivating virtue, despite being inherently consumerist. William Shakespeare's work was, at the time, something we could anachronistically call low art, though there would be those who would point out the lack of a capitalist superstructure in Shakespeare's context excludes it from the category of consumerist fiction, which we have been talking about. Perhaps that's fair enough, but it can't be overlooked how important it is for us today in trying to learn how to enjoy our fandoms in a cultivated way, to see that the playwright's works were enjoyed by the masses, including several fart jokes no less, and ended up being part of the canon of English literature. Shakespeare's pseudo-consumerist works were enjoyed by the masses, yes. But to put his works on a shelf besides the like of Dante, Chaucer, and Homer would seem as strange to an early modern Englishman as it would to us if we put Batman the Long Halloween beside them. 7 years after his death, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, Shakespeare's fellow actors, compiled 36 of Shakespeare's plays into something called the First Folio, a prestige collected volume similar to how a beloved comic run of a certain writer might be collected in a high-quality omnibus. This allowed Shakespeare's plays to gain more legitimacy as an authentic piece of literature and open up the possibility for critical analysis of the plays. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Englishmen would collect Shakespeare's plays and analyze them, publishing annotations and critical editions, and the playwright gradually became a national icon that symbolized the English cultural heritage and tradition. Indeed, Shakespeare's plays had real merit, and through the Romantic Revolution of the late 18th century into the 19th century, he became a part of the English literary canon. From widespread love of the masses into a prestigious collected volume to a higher cultural analysis of his works, Shakespeare went from low art to high art. He crossed the Great Divide. Arthur Conan Doyle is another such author whose more explicitly consumerist work of fiction changed English literature forever. Doyle invented the character Sherlock Holmes as a protagonist in a short story which eventually turned into a serial which he published for money. Indeed, the Romantic generation before Doyle had looked down upon serials and the way they were produced for profit. The words, they argued, became less meaningful when one was paid for each. But Victorian-era serials were heavily enjoyed even by elitists like T.S. Eliot. What makes the Sherlock situation so interesting is that Doyle had initially hated his creation, and had even played with the idea of killing him off or raising the price for his work to such a value that he thought no one in their right mind would pay for it. They did. Doyle wrote a total of 56 short stories and 4 novels centered around the character. Guinness World Records lists him as the most portrayed human literary character in film and television history, and the character has a large fandom even today. In fact, some say Sherlock Holmes fandom was the first modern fandom. The Holmes character has left a lasting impact on how mystery writing is conducted and on popular culture in general, in the same way the old classics of high art fame have impacted the literary canon. Even despite the motivations and thoughts of the artist, Sherlock Holmes has become high art. So, do I think franchise fiction tends towards becoming slop naturally? Yes. Do I think franchise fiction can become just as high in quality as some of the great works of classical literature? Also, yes. So what are we to do with this information? Radix, you say that even if the so-called woke problem was resolved, fandoms would still tend towards slop? Is there no hope? Well, friends, the fact of the matter is that there is no hope for fandom qua fandom. Your favorite franchise fiction will always tend towards slop. There is no possible outcome in which the franchise fiction in question starts putting out gold and always consistently puts out gold, and I think we know this. What I propose isn't an effort to save franchise fiction in and of itself. What I propose is to change how we engage with franchise fiction and to what extent we engage with franchise fiction. We were not made to be consumers, and we were not meant to consume content mindlessly. Remember the original purpose of literature: to cultivate, to develop culture, that is to say, virtue. We must remember that art is made to help us develop in some way. First and foremost, we need to be engaging with the classics, art that existed before the Industrial Revolution and were widely influential on civilization as a whole. Enjoy good works of visual art as well as poetry, literature, philosophy, and so on. This includes civilizational classics like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Greek tragedies, and so on. It also includes folklore, Beowulf, the Canterbury Tales, fairy tales, and so on. As a Christian, I would be amiss to leave out Holy Scripture and the lives and writings of the saints, and other important spiritual works from the tradition of the Church. These should be the main focus of your cultivation. But, of course, franchise fiction isn't all bad, and some can be very inspiring and cultivating in their own right. Besides proportionality, how should we engage with franchise fiction? Can we call ourselves fans of a thing we might recognize as 50% or more slop? Of all the points discussed in this essay, this may be the most obvious, but it is also a way of thinking that took time to develop in myself. Ever since I was a child, I was very much a completionist with the Transformers franchise. I wanted to know all the lore and continuity. And I did. For a time in 2015 and 2016, you could ask me any question about Transformers lore, and I would probably have a lot to say on the topic, hence the YouTube channel. But was it worth it? 2015 saw the beginning of The Shroud, and Transformers lore all began to fall apart, making way for the production of new content that hated me. No, it was not worth it. We, and by we I mean all fans who autistically consume as much content as possible from a franchise and obsessing over continuity and knowledge of fictional worlds, must dispel the myth of the continuity and canon of a franchise fictional universe. The fact of the matter is that franchises make changes to their fictional worlds all the time in an effort to get more customers, even if such decisions alienate the old consumer base. Sometimes these changes will be very blatant, like the hard reboots of DC's New 52, Transformers Shroud, or Star Wars abandoning the expanded universe. Other times, these changes will be more subtle and leave the old customers confused. Examples of this phenomena can be found in the Elder Scrolls subtle retcons in each game, or Marvel Comics quietly pushing their timeline forward so that characters who fought in World War II now actually fought in Vietnam, now actually fought in Afghanistan, a concept that only works in the abstract. Franchises will, in the name of business and profit, throw away old customers at any time for their benefit. Fans like me must understand that canon is a social contract, and if the franchise company can break it at any time, so can we. We can ignore installments of the franchise. Franchise fiction often takes the form of a shared universe, or expanded universe, or cinematic universe. These gimmicks are inherently a marketing campaign in which media is created in multiple formats or under multiple titles, and the consumer is expected to consume multiple media forms and purchase multiple products along the way to get the perception that they are getting the entire story, as if such a thing existed. When continuity, canon, and quality can vary quite dramatically at any time, the fan must wake up and realize that he has been played. There are times when expanded universes and sequels aren't the worst things in the world. There are no complaints when an expanded universe shares in the creative vision of the original creative director, respects the original idea and direction of the franchise, and makes strong quality connections between installments. When it comes to franchises that operate on an iteration-by-iteration basis, like Transformers today, a certain amount of reverence towards the source material is required to resonate with fans and not come off as a cynical cash grab. But it is also important to understand the origin of the creative spirit and how that creative spirit interacts with the expanded work. Many franchises originate from one creative spirit. Let's take Star Wars and George Lucas, for example. In the Star Wars Expanded Universe, Legends, many artists created high-quality releases that expanded the world of Star Wars. However, while George Lucas took an active interest in LucasArts projects, he did not always agree with what was happening in the EU. That being said, he did not reject their status as stories, and he did not reject the existence of the stories, but he also understood that they were not part of his creation, his creative vision, his Star Wars. The EU ensured that there was always fun and exciting Star Wars content on the shelves while the films were between releases for the sake of the franchise, but Lucas did not consider the EU to be canon. As a result, his later work on the prequel trilogy and the Clone Wars cartoon contradicted much of the EU canon. Star Wars Legends worked on a soft canon model, where there was a core franchise and an expanded franchise, but the core franchise had the liberty to take from the expanded franchise when it wanted to do so, but also completely overwrite the expanded universe if it wanted to. This was good for Lucas's artistic integrity. However, soft canon does not work well for a business. If a future move can just retcon it, why consume EU products at all? Because of this, we can compare how Lucas ran Star Wars and how Disney has been running Star Wars, as hard canon. Disney has been operating on a much more defined hard canon, where works are interconnected in a shared universe. This fuels the desire of the consumer to try to get the whole story by purchasing more products and therefore helping Disney's sales. While Lucas wanted the EU to be fun and exciting, Disney is making a product. But we have a similar question to ask of Disney's Star Wars that we asked in regards to the EU canon. If hard canon can be retconned at any time by the company, rather than by any one main artistic vision, why bother trying to keep up with hard canon at all? I have noticed this attitude has been prominent in American comics fandom for a while, especially in the 2010s and 2020s. It is an open secret now that comic book writers, while working in a shared and expanded universe, do their own work on the characters they write, choosing as they see fit to reference or not reference the work of earlier artists in the continuity or events happening in other books set in the same universe. If you try to take American comic continuity seriously, you will go insane. It is an illusion. It is not real. Canon is not real. It is a social contract between the creator and the audience, and if creators create something of low quality or disrespects the source material, the audience has the privilege to ignore the work. Rather than worrying about hard canon, we must understand that every piece of work has its own soft canon, which it may choose to reference or not reference at different times. Consider the Sherlock franchise. Yes, Sherlock became a pop culture phenomenon, but it also spun off into a wide range of reimaginings and adaptations of a wide variety of quality. When one looks at the Sherlock franchise, one realizes that adaptations and reimaginings do not have the ability to actually ruin source material, and that a healthy fan compartmentalizes these works into their own separate categories. We are hardwired in our approach to art to confuse one story as the work of one mind, one creator with one direction, and as such, we confuse the revolving door of creators on a franchise fiction as being an actual living story. We subconsciously think about it as a story directed by an author whose direction and thoughts are carried forward by the next writer to pick up the pen, and so on. But understand that when fiction starts passing between creatives, it stops being a living story with one creative vision. Rather, each new entry in the series by a new creator is inherently a different work of creative genius. Two products are created by two separate minds which may contradict each other. There is this strange view that we hold an institution with legal custodial rights over an intellectual property as having the ability to overwrite or otherwise change the artistic vision of the previous holders of the intellectual property. This is simply not how art works. Both works exist concurrently as testaments to the vision of each creator. Rings of Power does not ruin the Lord of the Rings films, just as the films do not ruin the original books. They are separate pieces of fiction created by different minds. One may accept two or more works created by different minds set in what marketing teams call the same universe, so long as it meets your criteria, such as reverence. But you are by no means forced to like or even watch Rings of Power just because you are a Lord of the Rings fan. So, some tips. Understand that so-called canon as declared by a company in charge of a franchise fictional world is not like the church pulling together the books of the Holy Bible. Companies do not dictate the destination of your immortal soul if you are faithful to them. Brands should not be your religion. The companies are merely legal custodians to an intellectual property as a legal concept. It is okay to give preference to some pieces of work of a franchise over others. You are not required to follow the rules created by marketing teams and obnoxious fandoms. Compartmentalize the works you like and the works you don't like. Bad installments only ruin the art if you let it. Focus particularly on classic, iconic works of the franchise fiction. For Batman, for example, focus on the books that define the character. Year One, The Long Halloween, Death in the Family, and build your canon from books that meet your standards from there. When it comes to the appreciation of franchise fiction art, frankly, your headcanon is just as good and valid as officially produced works by the company. Your creative spirit has just as much bearing on other works as other hired writers do on works that are not their own. Understand that you don't actually like the works of a franchise, you like the works of certain creators. Try to identify the creators behind the works you like, as that is the human mind that is driving the art. Perhaps they have made other pieces that you would enjoy. If you really like Simon Furman's Transformers books, you are more likely to enjoy another series written by Simon Furman than you are to enjoy the next piece of Transformers media written by who knows who. Fanfiction can be, and often is, actually good, but this could be something to explore with more nuance in another essay. There is another thing we should think about. If franchise fiction tends towards slop, we should work to create an environment so that a creative with legitimate talent does not feel the need to work for franchises that stifle his creative spirit. Consider supporting indie creators if you can. A project that comes to mind is Jonathan Pajot's Tales for Once and Ever project, or his God's Dog project, as he seeks to create quality retellings of fairy tales and traditions steeped in meaning as a sort of opposite version of Disney. In summary, franchise fiction will always tend towards being slop due to its consumerist nature. The managerial leveling force of woke, while not a minor problem, is not the only problem with franchise fiction. Despite tendencies towards slop, low art pieces have the capacity of being great works of art. The purpose of art is to cultivate us, not to be consumed. In a well-ordered life, franchise fiction is experienced in proper proportionality with civilizational classics, folk art, and holy tradition. Canon in franchise fiction can be disregarded. Do not feel tied down by marketing strategies, but instead enjoy franchise fiction works that are high quality and iconic. Support modern creators with true artistic spirit. These are the thoughts I am having at this stage. It's fascinating to think about how much my philosophy and attitudes towards art have changed in the past 5 years, especially from 2021 to 2024. I spent much of my time reading through classics and philosophy rather than enjoying the old pieces of fiction I used to enjoy. Events surrounding those franchises had soured me. But this march through philosophy has led me back where I started, albeit with a better appreciation and more discerning eye towards the works I enjoy, and deciding which works I will spend my time enjoying rather than being a completionist consuming all of the corporate slop. I hope these thoughts and feelings are understandable or sympathetic to some of you out there, and if any of my words have helped you with anything regarding your own attitudes towards franchise fiction, I am overjoyed. Perhaps with this new framework, I can enjoy consumerist fiction again, but especially the works that have actual merit.